Firstly, I want to thank Joyce and Allison and Corey and Kate. Their presentations were amazing and really inspiring as far as things that we can do with the community. This is a slightly different tenor for this discussion. And maybe it's something that you can all relate to, but I promise I am getting to the community participation point in a second. But let me give you some background. I'm with King County, Washington, which is Seattle and the suburbs around it. And we were facing 3 issues at the exact same time this summer. And I'm sure that almost all of you can relate to it. We were addressing some very significant backlog issues. And so let me share my screen and I'll explain to you that the type of background issues that we are facing. You can see from the screen, hopefully, that the thin blue line across the screen is our average of cases that we typically have in our criminal justice system at any one time. These are felonies. And it's about 3,200 felonies pending at any one time. The blue dots going up and down is where we were pre-COVID, and then the red is where we are post-COVID. And so our pending caseload is extraordinarily high right now. And I don't think that that's just unique for us. I think that that is probably true with everybody. And so we were dealing with that. We were also dealing with a growing backlog of cases that needed to be filed. And that's just continuing to grow for obvious reasons. The second issue we are dealing with is budget issues. Because our budget is tied to tax revenue, as most people's are, and there was no sales tax. There was a dip in that. We are dealing with massive budget issues. In fact, to the tune of $8.8 million deficit that we are facing. And so the third issue that we were dealing with all at the same time had to deal with sort of the whole community post George Floyd, and these very strong calls, and rightfully so, for more community participation in prosecution. And so the combination of these 3 factors made us try and sort of figure this issue out in a more systemic way. Now, typically, to deal with backlog issues, to deal with budget issues, we would slough off a certain number of cases to our municipality friends, quite frankly. Our driving with license suspended, our low-level drug offenses, we would simply say we're not taking them anymore. And we would have our municipalities sort of pick up the slack if they could. And in doing that in the past, we had convinced our county council that for every X number of cases that we sent off to municipal court, they would save in their budget by having fewer public defenders and fewer court costs and that sort of thing. And of course, this caused massive issues at the municipal level. And we were trying to figure out, is there a type of case that we could just sort of decriminalize or send to the municipal court level? And there really wasn't at this point. So we really started to look towards diversionary programs. And 2 of the problems that I think most people deal with diversionary programs are this. The first one is divert to what? Is this just a program where somebody has to sort of keep their nose clean for X amount of months and we just sort of say we're good? And then the other issue is victims. Victims often have to agree to waive any sort of restitution to get a defendant into a diversionary program, or you're limiting your population of diversionary programs to those without victims or restitution, which really is a very narrow band of cases potentially. So we started to develop in my office a concept of, which is not necessarily unique, but a community diversion program. And so hopefully you can see my screen here. but a community diversion program would be a pre-filing program that is offered one time exclusively for first-time offenders who are facing a low-level property or drug offense. And you know, when I was thinking about this in terms of diversion, a lot of times diversion is tied to the type of crime that somebody commits, but I wasn't sure how successful that was going to be. We've all seen in our own jurisdictions that there are people who commit certain types of crimes over and over and over again, and they may not be good candidates. The candidate I was looking for is somebody who is actually going to sort of get the message with the diversionary program. And what we determined, which is probably not news to any of you, is that there's a tipping point in our system. There are very few people who have only one felony in our criminal justice system, and we did a data analysis of this. Most people, once they get their first felony, continue to commit more and more felonies. That's probably obvious, but it's because there's a lot of collateral consequences that flow from a first felony that are outside of the judicial system. There's consequences related to occupational licensing restrictions, housing restrictions, educational restrictions, welfare implications. And so we wanted to see if we could capture those individuals who are facing their first felony, but also make sure that it was a low enough felony that we're not talking about crimes of violence or gun offenses or anything like that. And, you know, in looking at the typical case flow for these low-level felonies, it's a very expensive, time-consuming process that really doesn't result in much good. And I'll just be frank with that. We file charges, defense counsel's assigned, bail's addressed, there's multiple hearings over several months, which lead to warrants, which lead to more arrests, which leads to jail bookings. And then the case will ultimately resolve with a plea to a reduced sentence. The sentencing occurs well after the crime has occurred. Restitution is ordered, but it's paid in, you know, like $20 increments, if at all. And so in all, we have multiple hearings, delay, system expenditures, and limited accountability. And there had to be a better way. So we were talking about how could we envision a better outcome for first felony low-level property or drug offenses that would satisfy the three issues that I talked to you about before: backlog, budget, community, and participation. And so we wanted to see if we can make victims whole up front. We wanted people to hold accountability in days, not months or years. Could we avoid costly warrants? And you all know, warrants lead to hostile police confrontations, which often lead to bad things happening. Could we engage our community-based, culturally competent service providers? Could we have offenders avoid the collateral consequences of their first felony conviction? And could we also tailor services to those who are under 25? And could we do that all for less than the cost of the current system? And the answer is yes. Now, this is still in the development phase, so don't get too excited. But the answer is we believe yes. We are going to have to limit our eligible offenses to property offenses and drug offenses. The public, the law enforcement, and the victims, we're not going to stand for us doing this with crimes against persons, violent crimes, DV, SAU, weapons offenses, repeat offenders, that sort of thing. So we're going to narrow our scope, but it's still going to be wider than what you might typically see in a diversionary program. And the idea was that from the savings that we would generate by not putting people through the typical criminal justice system, could we capture those defense dollars? Could we capture the court dollars? Could we capture the booking fees? We could employ a program where we have a manager or navigator who assesses the risks and needs of the individuals and direct them to culturally competent, community-based, pre-filing diversion programs, where the person has to acknowledge the harm that they caused by their action and be held accountable by engaging in services. And if the person didn't engage in services, then they would just simply send the case back to us and we could file it. But it gave them a chance. From the money of not putting these cases into the system, we wanted to create through our county a victim restoration fund. And this is a pretty unique piece. where we would have set aside several $100,000 to pay out victims of low-level property offenses so that they could have their deductibles covered.
Dan, you're muted and there's a 5-minute warning. There you go.
Okay, got it. Could we pay for the person's restitution upfront through a county fund, recognizing that that's still going to be cheaper than going through our typical criminal justice system, and they'd get their money upfront? The case flow would look like this. The police submit the low-level property offense to us. We would review it. We would eliminate repeat offenders. We would look at criminal history. We'd look at the facts alleged, the nature of the charges. We would contact the victims to assess their needs and coordinate payment. Eligible offenders are evaluated by a navigator directed to a culturally relevant, competent, community-based program to assess their needs and acknowledge the harm caused by their action. And if they fail to engage or they commit a new offense, then we reserve the right to refile the charge. This is essentially the case flow on how that would happen. The community partners are the ones that we are going to be reaching out to next to help design what that looks like. What is it that is going to be, and this is going to be really turning our power over to them. What would accountability look like from their standpoint? And really, we're going to defer that to them. Our goal is to defer the cases away from the system. They're going to help define what accountability looks like. If the person is not being held accountable, they'll send it back to us for filing. If they are being held accountable, great. It's a one and done program. If they never come back from the system, that's a win for all of us. The annual savings are that there be reduced use of county legal services, that's public defenders, reduced use of jail for booking, reduced use of court costs, reduced use of warrants, reduced use of pretrial services that we currently have, reduced use of police resources, and avoids declining to overburden municipal courts. And the result is that the victims are going to be made whole up front. Individuals are given a chance to avoid their first felony. Cases will adjust much quicker. Community partners are engaged. Disproportionality of the 18 to 24-year-olds will be diminished. The county, the police, the cities will all save money annually.
Dan, I want to just highlight one thing that is probably the most unusual part of it, which is that the victims are going to be paid out of county funds, not paid by the defendant. Is that correct?
It is, and that's raised some a lot of eyebrows, I would say, from the community. Why is taxpayer money going to be used to pay for a victim's cell phone that got stolen or that sort of thing? We are the county set aside a pot of money for this to explore this program because we were finding that our victims who were most impacted by a lot of property offenses came from the same communities as our offenders. And if somebody loses their car or somebody loses their cell phone, it means that they can't work and they're out of their job. And it's disproportionately affecting our victims of color too. And we wanted to make sure that we were there for them. And getting $20 a month, 2 years after the offense is not really helping them. So it's an equity and social justice issue for our victims as well. And so, yes, the case goes to diversion before it ever goes to court. The defendant will have to pay for restitution into this fund on the back end, but our victims will not have to wait for it. The victims will get paid up front. What we figured out in determining this, who is eligible, is that we looked at our restitution cases as they currently stand, and only about 25% of our cases for these low-level property offenses actually had restitution with them, and the average amount was less than $1,000. And so from that, we were able to calculate how much money the county should set aside. Our county did a financial analysis of this program, and they determined they were going to save about $10 million, and they were going to cut out our budget deficit that we were going to be facing if we could divert about 1,000 cases into this system. So by taking cases out of the system, we were able to address our budget issues, address our growing backlog, and answer the call for more community participation.
1 minute warning.
It's still a work in progress. We're going to be partnering with the university to determine how successful we are. And we're going to be tracking the cases internally, because as they come into us, we also convinced the county that we need at least a person in our office who will be tracking this information to determine if someone is successfully navigating this process. But you really have to set up some sort of binary tests. You know, is the person showing up? Has the person committed a new offense? This sort of squishy, are they doing really well or not well? That's not really going to fly. And some community partners very clearly will say, it's not, I don't want to be a narc. I don't want to be somebody who's going to be reporting that somebody's not doing well. It's going to take certain community partners who are willing to engage in this work to be able to do that. And we're going to have a community navigator through our county that's separate from our office, that's going to be working with the defendants to make sure that they are in compliant, and then send that information on to us. So I'm sorry I had to go through that fairly quickly, but happy to answer any questions that come through.